On a routine flight across the Atlantic, a single venomous request sets off a chain reaction of epic proportions. A woman dripping in wealth and privilege refused to sit next to a black man. She demanded a new seat, expecting the world to bend to her will. But what she got instead was a masterclass in public humiliation, delivered at 30 Alders to feet. Stick with us as we unravel how this single act of bigotry didn't just ruin her flight, but detonated her entire life in a spectacular display of real-time karma, proving that sometimes the universe doesn't wait to settle the score. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 714 from Atlanta to London hummed with a quiet, expensive energy. The scent of leather champagne and muted perfume filled the air. Businessmen in tailored suits reviewed quarterly reports on their laptops, while a Hollywood actress, hiding behind oversized sunglasses, scrolled through a script. It was a world of privilege, a bubble of comfort floating 7 miles above the earth. And into this bubble walked Susan Covington, a woman who wore her entitlement like a second skin. Susan was the wife of Richard Covington, a name synonymous with Atlanta real estate development. She was draped in a cream-colored cashmere shawl that probably cost more than the flight attendant's monthly salary. Her blonde hair perfectly coiffed her face, a carefully maintained mask of youthful indifference. She clutched a vintage Chanel bag to her chest as she navigated the aisle, her eyes scanning the seat numbers with an air of practiced authority. Her seat was 2B. As she arrived at her row, she stopped abruptly. A man was already settled in seat 2C by the window. He was a black man, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit with a crisp white shirt. He looked to be in his late 50s with a calm, dignified presence. His silver-flecked hair was neatly trimmed and he was engrossed in a thick medical journal, its pages filled with complex diagrams of the human heart. A pair of sophisticated horn-rimmed glasses sat perched on his nose. He glanced up as Susan approached, offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod, and returned thoughtful to his reading. Susan's perfectly lipsticked mouth tightened into a thin line. She didn't move. She simply stood in the aisle, her gaze fixed on the man, her expression shifting from surprise to disgust. The flight attendant, a warm and professional woman named Maria, approached her with a welcoming "Come on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Covington. Can I help you with your bag?" Maria asked, her voice calm and soothing. Susan didn't look at Maria. Her eyes were still locked on the man in 2C. "That's my seat," she said, her voice sharp and cold, gesturing vaguely towards the plush leather chair of 2B. "Yes, it is," Maria confirmed cheerfully. "Right next to the window seat there." Susan finally tore her gaze away from the man and fixed it on Maria. The look she gave the flight attendant could have curdled milk. "And who is that?" she asked, her voice low and dripping with disdain, as if the man were a piece of luggage someone had carelessly left behind. Maria's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She glanced at the man who seemed completely oblivious, still lost in his journal. "That is another passenger, ma'am. He's in seat 2C. "I'm not sitting next to him," Susan declared. It wasn't a request. It was a royal decree. The volume of her voice was just loud enough to slice through the cabin's quiet hum, causing the businessman in 3A to lower his newspaper and peer over the top. Maria, a veteran of the skies, had dealt with all manner of difficult passengers, from drunks to divas. But the undisguised racism of Susan's statement was jarring. She took a deep breath, her training kicking in. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem with the seat, ma'am?" she asked deliberately, misunderstanding the implication. "The problem," Susan said, enunciating each word as if speaking to a child, is that I paid for a first-class ticket. I paid for a premium experience. And that experience does not involve sitting next to him. The man in 2C finally lowered his journal, a bookmark carefully placed between the pages. He turned his head slowly and looked at Susan. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet, weary sort of disappointment. He didn't say a word. He simply held her gaze, his silence a more powerful rebuke than any shout could have been. Under his steady, intelligent gaze, a lesser person might have felt a prick of shame. Susan Covington was not a lesser person. She felt emboldened. "I want a different seat," she demanded, turning her full attention back to Maria. "Now." Ma'am Maria began, her voice still professionally level, but with a new edge of firmness. "The first-class cabin is completely full. Every seat is occupied. I can assure you that seat 2B is one of the best on the plane. I don't care if it's the throne of England." "I will not sit there," Susan snapped. Her voice was louder now, a petulant whip crack that turned more heads. The actress in 1D lowered her sunglasses, her brow furrowed with annoyance. "Find me another seat, or find him another seat. I don't care which. Just get it done." The man in 2C slowly closed his journal, the soft thud of the cover echoing in the tense silence. He looked from Susan's furious face to Maria's strained one. Perhaps he said, his voice a deep, calm baritone that commanded attention. "It would be easier if you just found the lady another seat. I have no desire to cause a disturbance." His politeness seemed to infuriate Susan even more. "Don't you talk to me," she spat. "This has nothing to do with you. This is about the standards of this airline." Maria knew this was escalating into a full-blown incident. The integrity of her cabin was at stake, not to mention the dignity of the passenger being so grotesquely insulted. "Mrs. Covington," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation, "I need you to lower your voice. You are disturbing the other passengers." She then leaned in slightly, speaking in a more confidential tone. "This airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. I can either help you to your assigned seat, or we can discuss this with the captain on the ground. But the plane will not be taking off while this issue is unresolved." The threat of being removed from the flight of the subsequent scandal and inconvenience finally seemed to penetrate Susan's bubble of outrage. Her face flushed a blotchy red. She shot a final hateful glare at the man in 2C before turning her back on him. "Fine," she hissed at Maria. "You go talk to your captain. Tell him that a loyal platinum-level customer is being made to feel uncomfortable. Tell him Susan Covington expects him to fix it. I will wait." She turned on her heel and marched back towards the galley, her cashmere shawl swirling behind her like a cape. She stood there, arms crossed, tapping an immaculately manicured finger against her Chanel bag, a statue of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She had no doubt that the captain, a man she assumed understood the pecking order of the world, would resolve this in her favor. After all, men like her husband funded the world the captain lived in. She was about to learn a very, very hard lesson about the world outside her gilded cage. And as Maria walked towards the cockpit, a young man in seat 4A, a freelance journalist named Ben Carter, discreetly activated the voice recorder on his phone. He had a feeling this was going to be more than just a story about a difficult passenger. The galley, a small, sterile space of stainless steel and tightly packed service carts, became Susan Covington's temporary throne room. She stood with her back to the cabin, a deliberate posture of defiance, expecting Maria to return momentarily with a groveling apology and a solution. In her mind, the hierarchy was clear. paying customer, especially a first-class one from a prominent family, was at the top. The airline staff were there to serve. The man in 2C was in her worldview an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order of things that needed to be corrected. Maria, however, did not go straight to the cockpit. Her first duty was to the passenger who had been so publicly maligned. She returned to row 2, kneeling slightly in the aisle to be at eye level with the man in 2C. "Sir," she said, her voice filled with a genuine warmth and regret that stood in stark contrast to Susan's venom. "On behalf of Atlantic Airways, I am so incredibly sorry you had to experience that. Her behavior is unacceptable and it will be addressed." The man who had since reopened his medical journal looked up at her. He offered a small, sad smile. "My name is David Harris," he said calmly. "And thank you, Maria. I appreciate that. But please don't worry about me. I've been a black man in America for 58 years. This is hardly my first encounter with insecurity." His choice of the word insecurity over racism was deliberate and surgical, and it struck Maria as profoundly insightful. He wasn't just labeling Susan. He was diagnosing her. "Still," Maria insisted, "it's not right. We don't stand for it. Is there anything at all I can get for you? A glass of champagne before takeoff? Anything?" Dr. Harris shook his head gently. "I'm fine. I'd just like to get to London. I have a conference to attend." He glanced towards the galley. "I suspect this may cause a delay." "I will do my best to ensure it doesn't," Maria promised. "The captain will handle it." With a final apologetic nod, she turned and made her way to the front of the plane, her face set with determination. The cockpit door was a sacred boundary, but this situation warranted crossing it. She gave the coded knock and waited. Meanwhile, Susan's wait was stretching from 1 minute into 5. Her impatience was beginning to curdle into fury. She could feel the eyes of the other first-class passengers on her back. She wasn't accustomed to being the subject of negative attention. She was used to being admired, envied, or at the very least, ignored by those she considered her lessers. This simmering judgment was a new and unpleasant sensation. The businessman in 3A, a stout, florid man named George Findlay, leaned across the aisle to the actress in 1D. "Can you believe the nerve of some people?" he muttered, not bothering to keep his voice down. "Utterly disgraceful." The actress, whose name was Chloe Vance, pushed her sunglasses up onto her head, revealing eyes that were sharp and intelligent. "It's disgusting," she agreed. "And over what the man is better dressed than half the people in here. He's probably more interesting too." Their words carried on the recycled cabin air reached Susan's ears. Her cheeks burned. These were her people, her class. They were supposed to understand. They were supposed to share her perspective, her unspoken belief in a certain kind of social stratification. Their casual condemnation felt like a betrayal. In seat 4A, Ben Carter continued to record, angling his phone slightly to capture the tableau. Susan fuming in the galley, the other passengers murmuring their disapproval, and Dr. David Harris sitting with an almost saintly calm amidst the turmoil he had not created. This was gold. The juxtaposition was cinematic. The entitled Karen versus the dignified black gentleman. He knew he had the central conflict for a story that could travel far and wide on social media. He just needed the climax. Inside the cockpit, Maria was giving a concise professional summary of the situation to Captain Michael Romano. Romano was a pilot of the old-school calm authoritative with a neatly trimmed grey moustache and a no-nonsense demeanor. He had flown military transports in Desert Storm before transitioning to commercial aviation. He had seen and heard it all. He listened to Maria without interruption, his eyes fixed on the instrument panel as if the conversation were a routine pre-flight check. "And she's refusing to take her seat, Captain," Maria concluded. "She's demanding we move her, or Dr. Harris." Captain Romano let out a slow breath. He turned in his chair to face Maria, his expression unreadable. "What's the passenger's name again?" "Susan Covington. Her husband is Richard Covington, the developer." Maria offered this information not as an excuse for Susan's behavior, but as a necessary piece of the puzzle. Prominent passengers could sometimes cause bigger headaches later on. The captain nodded slowly, processing this. "Covington. Right." He looked at his first officer, a younger man named Alex, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Well, Alex, it seems Mrs. Covington is feeling uncomfortable." There was a slight ironic emphasis on the word uncomfortable that did not escape Maria. "What's the protocol here, Captain?" Alex asked. "The protocol," Romano said, a faint, almost mischievous glint in his eye, "is to ensure the safety and comfort of all our passengers, and to uphold the standards and values of this airline. Sometimes those duties require a little bit of creative problem-solving." He looked back at Maria. "Is there by any chance an open seat anywhere on this aircraft?" Maria paused, thinking. "No, sir. Not in first class. Or business. The flight is completely full. We might have... Wait. Yes, there was a last-minute cancellation. A no-show." "And where is this seat?" the captain asked, leaning forward slightly. "Seat 38E, sir," Maria replied. "Middle seat, back of economy, right by the lavatories." A slow smile spread across Captain Romano's face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated inspiration. A smile that said he had just found the perfect karmic solution to his problem. "Maria," he said, his voice now imbued with a newfound cheerfulness. "Go back to the cabin. I'm going to make an announcement. I think I've found a way to accommodate Mrs. Covington's special request." As Maria exited the cockpit, a sense of anticipation tingled in the air. She exchanged a look with Ben Carter as she passed his seat, and he gave her a subtle nod, his phone still recording. He knew the climax was coming. Susan Covington, still fuming in the galley, saw Maria emerge from the cockpit and straightened up, a smug, triumphant look settling on her features. Finally. The captain had seen reason. She was about to get what she wanted. The natural order was about to be restored. The soft two-tone chime that precedes a cockpit announcement echoed through the cabin, momentarily silencing the murmurs of the passengers. It was a sound that usually signaled routine information about flight time or turbulence. Today it felt different. It felt charged with significance. Susan Covington's smug expression intensified. She took a half step out of the galley, ready to graciously accept the captain's apology and be shown to her new upgraded, or at the very least, suitably isolated seat. She expected him to speak directly to her, perhaps even come out of the cockpit to handle the matter personally. Instead, Captain Romano's voice, calm and clear as a bell, filled the entire aircraft, from the rarefied air of first class to the cramped quarters of economy. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We apologize for the slight departure delay. We've just been dealing with a small issue up here in the first-class cabin." Susan preened. This was it. The public acknowledgement of her grievance. The captain continued, his voice maintaining its professional, even tone. "We have a passenger here," he said, and every passenger in first class knew exactly who he was talking about, who is uncomfortable in her assigned seat. He let the word hang in the air for a moment, The quotation marks were audible in his inflection. In seat 4A, Ben Carter suppressed a grin. This was better than he could have imagined. It is not our policy to force any passenger to endure a long-haul flight under any kind of distress. Captain Romano went on, his voice a smooth balm of corporate empathy. Our primary goal is the comfort and well-being of everyone on board. We always strive to accommodate our passengers' needs to the best of our ability. Susan nodded, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Exactly, she thought. Finally, someone who understands service. Now the captain said, his voice taking on a slightly more cheerful, problem-solving quality. The first-class cabin is completely booked. However, we have been fortunate. It appears we have had a last-minute cancellation, and a single seat has just become available on this flight. A wave of confusion rippled through the first-class cabin. If the cabin was full, where was this seat? Had they miscounted? Susan's mind raced. Perhaps a crew member had a private bunk they would give up for her. Or maybe there was a special unlisted seat reserved for VIPs. The possibilities were delicious. Then came the hammer blow. So to the passenger in question, Captain Romano announced, his voice booming with mock magnanimity. I am delighted to offer you a solution. We are more than happy to move you to our available seat in row 38. That should resolve your discomfort entirely. Silence. A profound, stunned, beautiful silence descended upon the first-class cabin. The businessman, George Findlay, choked back a laugh, covering his mouth with his hand. Chloe Vance, the actress, slowly slid her sunglasses back down onto her nose, a wide, incredulous smile spreading across her face. Dr. David Harris. The object of Susan's initial scorn simply stared ahead, but the corner of his mouth twitched just once. Susan Covington stood frozen, the smug look on her face melting away like wax, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Row 38. That wasn't first class. That wasn't even business class. That was... She did the mental math, picturing the layout of the aircraft. That was the absolute back of the plane. The captain, with the masterful timing of a seasoned performer, wasn't finished yet. Furthermore, he added, his voice now laced with an unmistakable thread of steel. We have another passenger in seat 2C, Dr. David Harris, a distinguished surgeon on his way to a medical conference in London, who has been made to feel most unwelcome. To him, I offer the sincerest apologies on behalf of our entire crew. We hope that this new arrangement will allow him to have the peaceful and pleasant flight he deserves. He had named her victim. He had given him a name, a profession, a purpose. He had elevated him from a mere seat occupant to a respected professional, a victim of her prejudice. In doing so, he had stripped Susan of any remaining shred of justification. He had painted the picture for the entire plane to see a bigoted, entitled woman had harassed a doctor, and the airline was siding unequivocally with the doctor. Cabin crew, please prepare for departure, the captain concluded, his voice returning to its normal brisk tone. The announcement was over. The silence in first class broke. It wasn't a loud noise, but a series of soft, suppressed snorts and chuckles. George Findlay was now shaking with silent laughter. The spell of decorum was broken. Susan Covington had become a punchline. Maria approached her, her face a perfect, unreadable mask of professional neutrality. Mrs. Covington, she said, her voice soft but firm. Shall I show you to your new seat? Susan stared at her, her face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Fury, humiliation, disbelief. She was trapped, The captain had laid a perfect, inescapable snare. Her choices were stark and humiliating. She could refuse the offer and return to seat 2B next to the man she had so publicly denigrated. To do so would be to admit defeat, to crawl back with her tail between her legs and endure 8 hours of silent, burning shame under the watchful eyes of every other passenger. Or she could accept the solution. She could take the long walk of shame down the length of the entire plane, past the smirking faces in business class, past the curious stares in premium economy, way to the back of the bus. She could trade her throne for a middle seat by the toilets, a public testament to the consequences of her own venom. She had demanded to be moved. The captain in his infinite wisdom had granted her wish. "Mrs. Covington," Maria repeated gently. The blood rushed to Susan's face. The stares, the stifled laughter, the sheer crushing weight of her public humiliation. It was too much. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't face Dr. Harris. She couldn't face anyone. With a strangled sob of pure rage, she snatched her Chanel bag. "Fine," she spat the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'll move." She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crawl back to 2B. She would take the downgrade. It was a choice made not out of logic, but out of pure, spiteful pride. As she pushed past Maria and began the long, agonizing walk down the aisle, she was oblivious to the fact that her nightmare was only just beginning. She was focused on the injustice of it all, blind to the perfect, beautiful karma of the moment. And in seat 4A, Ben Carter saved his recording and started typing a new file. He labeled it the Walk of Shame. The walk from the first-class galley to seat 38E was the longest journey of Susan Covington's life. Every step was an exercise in humiliation. The lush, thick carpet of first class gave way to the thinner, more functional flooring of business class, and then to the standard-issue navy blue of economy. The generous private pods were replaced by rows of seats that grew progressively narrower and closer together. The air itself seemed to change, losing its scent of champagne and exclusivity replaced by the faint, ubiquitous smell of jet fuel and packaged snacks. As Susan marched down the aisle, her head held high in a futile attempt to project defiance, she became a spectacle. The story of the racist passenger being sent to the back of the plane had already spread through the cabin like wildfire, transmitted through text messages and whispered conversations. Passengers in business class lowered their noise-cancelling headphones to stare. In premium economy, people craned their necks to get a better look. She felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny pinpricks of judgment. She saw their expressions, amusement, contempt, and a kind of righteous satisfaction. They saw her not as Susan Covington, wife of Richard Covington, a pillar of Atlanta society, but as a caricature, a living meme. The Karen of Flight 740. When she finally reached the back of the plane, the atmosphere was even more chaotic. The last few rows were where families with young children were often seated. A baby was crying, a toddler was kicking the back of the seat in front of him, and the proximity to the lavatories created a near-constant stream of traffic in the aisle. Seat 38E was, as advertised, a middle seat. To her left sat a young, heavily tattooed man, listening to heavy metal on his headphones, the tinny sound bleeding out for all to hear. To her right sat a portly, sweating man who had already taken his shoes off and was encroaching on her allotted space. The seat itself felt like a medieval torture device compared to the plush leather throne she had abandoned. A flight attendant from the economy section, A young man with a weary smile gestured to the seat. "Here you are, ma'am. Let me know if you need anything." His professional tone was undercut by the slight twinkle in his eye. He knew exactly who she was and how she had ended up here. Susan crammed herself into the seat, her cashmere shawl feeling absurdly out of place. She didn't bother to put her Chanel bag in the overhead compartment, instead clutching it to her chest like a life raft. The man on her right let out a loud burp that smelled of onions. The baby in the row behind her screamed. This was her personal hell. For the next 8 hours, this was her world. Meanwhile, back in the quiet sanctuary of first class, a very different scene was unfolding. With Susan's toxic presence removed, a sense of calm and collegiality had been restored. The flight attendants, led by Maria, moved through the cabin with renewed efficiency and warmth. A round of complimentary champagne was offered to all the passengers in first class, a silent toast to the restoration of order. The seat next to Dr. David Harris 2B was now empty. Maria approached him. "Dr. Harris," she said, "please feel free to use the extra space. Put your briefcase there. Stretch out. It's the least we can do." "Thank you, Maria. That's very kind," he said. A few minutes later, George Findlay, the businessman from 3A, unbuckled his seatbelt and walked over. "Dr. Harris," he said, extending a hand. "George Findlay. I just wanted to say I was appalled by what happened earlier. Absolutely disgraceful. You handled it with more grace than I would have." Dr. Harris shook his hand. "David Harris. And thank you, Mr. Findlay. It was an unfortunate situation." "Call me George," Findlay insisted, settling into the empty seat of 2B. "You're a surgeon," the captain said. "Cardiac." Dr. Harris nodded. "That's right. I'm the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins." George Findlay's eyebrows shot up. Johns Hopkins was not just a hospital. It was a global institution, a name synonymous with medical excellence. Johns Hopkins. My goodness, we're in the presence of greatness. He wasn't just being polite, he was genuinely impressed. Findlay was the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, MedInnovate Inc., and he knew the medical world intimately. "Hardly greatness," Dr. Harris chuckled. "Just a man who's good with his hands and enjoys a complex puzzle." "Don't be so modest," George said. "The work you people do is incredible. In fact, we at MedInnovate are just entering the final trial phase for a new anticoagulant, specifically for post-op recovery in heart valve replacement patients. The data is looking revolutionary." Dr. Harris's interest was piqued. "Is that right? What's the mechanism of action?" The two men fell into an easy, animated conversation. They talked about medical technology, the challenges of modern healthcare, and the future of cardiac treatment. They were two masters of their respective fields, finding common ground and mutual respect. Dr. Harris, who had been prepared to spend the flight quietly reading, found himself engaged in a stimulating and enjoyable dialogue. He had gone from being the object of a woman's ignorant hatred to a valued conversational partner for a captain of industry. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into a comfortable rhythm. Chloe Vance, the actress, took off her sunglasses and asked Maria for a pen, beginning to make notes on her script. Ben Carter, the journalist, was furiously typing on his laptop, the words flowing effortlessly. He wasn't just transcribing events anymore. He was crafting a narrative, weaving together the threads of prejudice, professionalism, and poetic justice. And in the back of the plane, in seat 38E, Susan Covington stewed in a broth of rage and self-pity. The man next to her had fallen asleep and was now snoring loudly, his head occasionally lolling onto her shoulder. She was trapped a queen in exile, dreaming of revenge. She composed angry emails to the airline in her head, planned scathing social media posts, and imagined the fury of her husband Richard when he heard how she had been treated. She was certain he would bring the full weight of his influence down upon Atlantic Airways. He would make them pay. She had lost the battle, but she was convinced she would win the war. She had no idea that the universe was just getting warmed up and that the real karma had yet to be delivered. 4 hours into the flight, the plane was a dark, quiet tube soaring through the night sky. Most passengers were asleep, lulled by the drone of the engines. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft blue, and the flight attendants moved like ghosts in the aisles, collecting empty plastic cups and offering blankets. In seat 38E, Susan Covington was not asleep. She had tried, but the cramped conditions and her simmering rage made it impossible. She had refused the complimentary meal, a sad-looking pasta dish served in a tinfoil container, and had spent the last 2 hours staring at the seatback in front of her, her mind a toxic swamp of grievances. She felt a migraine starting to bloom behind her eyes. Every snore from the man next to her, every cry from the baby behind her, was a fresh assault on her frayed nerves. Suddenly the calm was shattered. A frantic chiming of the flight attendant call button pierced the quiet, followed by a woman's panicked cry. "Help, somebody help! I think he's having a heart attack." The shout came from the business class cabin a few rows ahead of the economy section. Lights snapped on, heads popped up over the tops of seats, and a wave of alarm washed through the plane. Flight attendants rushed towards the source of the commotion. In seat 12D, a man was slumped over, clutching his chest. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. His wife was shaking him, her face a mask of terror. The senior flight attendant, a calm and experienced woman named Linda, took charge immediately. "Get the defibrillator and the medical kit now," she commanded a junior colleague. She turned to the distressed passenger. "Sir, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." The man's eyes fluttered, but he didn't respond. His breathing grew fainter. Linda's voice, amplified by the PA system, cut through the rising panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board. Please remain in your seats. Is there a doctor on this flight?" I repeat. Is there a doctor on board? Back in seat 38. Susan heard the announcement with a detached sense of annoyance. A medical emergency. Just another inconvenience. Another delay. It would probably mean they'd have to divert the plane landing in Iceland or some other god-forsaken place. Her miserable journey was about to get even longer. The thought that a person's life was hanging in the balance barely registered. Her world had shrunk to the size of her own discomfort. Up in the serene bubble of first class, the announcement had a very different effect. Dr. David Harris and George Findlay had been in a deep and engaging conversation for hours. They had moved from medicine to world politics and were now debating the merits of a vintage Bordeaux. When the call for a doctor came, Dr. Harris didn't hesitate for a second. He placed his wine glass carefully on the tray table, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood up all in one smooth, economical motion. "That would be me," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. Maria, who was already on her way to the business class cabin, saw him stand. A look of profound relief washed over her face. "Dr. Harris, thank God. He's in 12D. Dr. Harris was already moving down the aisle, his long strides eating up the distance. He exuded an aura of complete and total competence. As he passed Ben Carter's seat, the young journalist's eyes widened. The story had just taken an incredible dramatic turn. This was no longer just about social justice. It was about life and death. He grabbed his phone, switching it to video mode. When Dr. Harris arrived in business class, he found a scene of controlled chaos. The flight attendants were doing their best, but the passenger was clearly in critical condition. "I'm Dr. Harris," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "Everyone please give me some room to work." The flight attendants parted like the Red Sea. He knelt beside the stricken passenger, his fingers immediately going to the man's carotid artery to check for a pulse. "What's his name? Does he have any known medical conditions?" he asked the man's wife, his tone gentle but firm. Arthur Bainbridge," the woman sobbed. "He has a heart condition. He had a stent put in last year." Dr. Harris's face was a study in concentration. "Pulse is thready and fast. He's in V-fib. We need to shock him." He looked at Linda. "Do you have aspirin?" "Yes, right here," she said, producing a small bottle from the medical kit. "Good. Let's get 4 of these under his tongue if we can." He turned his attention to the automated external defibrillator AED that another attendant had brought. He ripped open the man's shirt, exposing his chest, and expertly applied the pads following the device's diagram. "Okay, charging," he said, his voice steady. "Everybody clear." The automated voice of the AED droned. "Shock advised. Push the shock button." Dr. Harris pushed the button. The man's body convulsed. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Then a ragged gasp. The name Arthur Bainbridge had not registered with Dr. Harris, nor with most of the passengers. But it sent a jolt of pure ice through Susan Covington's veins. She had heard the name screamed by the distraught wife, and it had penetrated her bubble of self-pity. Arthur Bainbridge. She knew that name. He wasn't just some random passenger. He was the founder and chairman of the board of Tech Vantage, a massive London-based tech conglomerate. And Tech Vantage was the company her husband, Richard Covington, had been desperately trying to merge with for the past 6 months. The deal was Richard's magnum opus, the crowning achievement of his career. It was a billion-dollar merger that would elevate the Covington name from local real estate moguls to international players. Their entire future, their social standing, their next level of wealth was riding on this deal. Richard had flown to London 2 days earlier to prepare for the final round of meetings, and Arthur Bainbridge was the man he had to win over. He was the king, the final boss, and he was dying in row 12. Suddenly, the abstract annoyance of a medical emergency became a terrifying personal crisis for Susan. She craned her neck, trying to see past the rows of seats, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she heard the whispers filtering back through the cabin. The flight attendants and a few passengers who had a clearer view were murmuring in awe. "It's the man from 2C, someone whispered a few rows ahead. "The one that woman made a fuss about." "He's a doctor," said another. "Looks like he knows exactly what he's doing." "He's saving that man's life." Susan's blood ran cold. The man she had insulted, the man she had refused to sit next to, the man she had banished from her presence, was now the only thing standing between her family's future and utter ruin. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, she felt like she couldn't breathe. The business-class cabin transformed into a makeshift emergency room. Under the steady command of Dr. David Harris, the space became a hub of focused, life-saving activity. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a conductor orchestrating a delicate symphony to pull a man back from the brink of death. "I need an IV line," he said to Linda, the senior flight attendant. "Do you have a saline drip in the kit?" "Yes, doctor." "Good. And get me a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope." The flight attendants, now his ad hoc surgical team, moved with a newfound purpose. They were trained for emergencies, but there was a world of difference between protocol and having a world-class surgeon guiding their every move. Dr. Harris's calm demeanor was infectious, cutting through the fear and replacing it with focused action. He worked on Arthur Bainbridge with an almost divine intensity. He listened to the man's heart, his brow furrowed in concentration. He monitored the readouts from the AED, which now showed a steadier, albeit still weak, rhythm. "His pressure is bottoming out," Dr. Harris murmured almost to himself. "We need to get fluids into him fast." He took the IV kit from Linda and with a surgeon's steady hand found a vein in Arthur's arm. On the first try, a difficult task on a dehydrated hypotensive patient in a vibrating airplane cabin. As the saline solution began to flow, a little bit of color started to return to Arthur's ashen face. George Findlay, the CEO of Med Innovate, watched from the aisle, his arms crossed. He was utterly captivated. He had seen countless presentations on medical procedures, viewed simulations and funded research, but he had never witnessed something so raw, so real. He was watching a master at his craft, applying years of knowledge and experience in the most challenging environment imaginable. He wasn't just impressed. He was in awe. Ben Carter, the journalist, was documenting it all. He moved discreetly around the periphery, his phone's camera capturing the intense drama. He filmed Dr. Harris's hands as they worked the concerned faces of the flight attendants, the tear-streaked face of Arthur Bainbridge's wife, Eleanor, who was now holding her husband's hand, whispering his name. He knew this was more than a viral story about a racist passenger. This was a story about a hero. For 20 agonizing minutes, Dr. Harris worked monitoring, adjusting, and stabilizing. He had Arthur's wife talk to him, telling him to hold on, that help was on the way. He had the flight attendants keep him warm with blankets. He managed the entire situation with a grace and authority that was nothing short of breathtaking. Finally, Arthur's eyes fluttered open again. This time, they were focused. He looked weakly at his wife, then at the black man in the impeccable suit who was kneeling over him. What happened?" Arthur whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Dr. Harris gave him a reassuring smile. "Mr. Bainbridge, you gave us all a bit of a scare. You're on a plane to London and you've had a cardiac event. My name is Dr. David Harris. You're stable for now, but we need to get you to a hospital as soon as we land." Eleanor Bainbridge burst into tears this time of relief. "Thank you," she sobbed, looking at Dr. Harris with an expression of pure, unadulterated gratitude. "Oh my God, thank you. You saved him. You saved his life." Dr. Harris simply nodded. "I'm just glad I was here to help." The captain's voice came over the PA system again, this time with a note of urgency and relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been in contact with air traffic control. We have been given priority clearance to land at Heathrow. Paramedics will be meeting the aircraft at the gate. Please, for the time being, I ask that everyone return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." He paused, then added, his voice filled with emotion. "And on behalf of the entire crew, and I'm sure all the passengers, our deepest, most profound thanks to Dr. David Harris for his incredible actions here today." A spontaneous round of applause erupted throughout the plane. It started in business class and spread backwards through economy, a wave of gratitude and admiration. In seat 38, Susan Covington heard the applause. She heard the captain's words. She heard the name Dr. David Harris, lionized, celebrated, and thanked. Each clap was a hammer blow to her ego. Each word of praise was a shovelful of dirt on the grave of her social standing. The situation was now a perfect storm of personal and financial ruin. The man whose life hung in the balance was the key to her husband's future. The man who had saved him was the one she had publicly scorned. The story with its heroes and villains was now crystal clear to everyone on board, and she was cast irrevocably as the villain. She could already see the headlines. She could imagine the story spreading through the tight-knit circles of Atlanta's elite. Her husband, Richard, prided himself on his reputation, on his ability to charm and build relationships. How could he possibly face Arthur Bainbridge now? How could he ask for a business deal when his own wife had treated the man's savior like garbage? The sheer exquisite and brutal karma of it all was crushing. She had built her world on a foundation of prejudice and entitlement, and in the space of a few hours that world had been brought crashing down by the quiet dignity and profound skill of the very man she had deemed beneath her. As the plane began its final descent into London, Susan felt a cold dread creep into her heart. The flight was ending, but her ordeal was just beginning. She had demanded a different seat, and in a way she had gotten her wish. She had been moved from a position of comfort and privilege to a place of public shame and imminent disaster. She was no longer Susan Covington, the powerful socialite. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale, a woman about to be hit by the full devastating force of the consequences she herself had set in motion. And on the ground below, her husband was waiting completely unaware that his billion-dollar dream had just died at 30,000 feet. The landing at Heathrow was seamless. As Flight 714 taxied to the gate, a fleet of emergency vehicles was already waiting on the tarmac, lights flashing silently. The moment the seatbelt sign switched off, a team of paramedics boarded the plane, led directly to row 12 by the flight attendants. The transfer of care was swift and professional. Dr. Harris gave the lead paramedic a concise, detailed report of Arthur Bainbridge's condition, the interventions performed, and the medications administered. The paramedics were visibly impressed by the level of care provided mid-air. As they carefully moved Arthur onto a gurney, his wife Eleanor paused. She turned to Dr. Harris, her eyes still wet with tears, but now shining with immense gratitude. She took both of his hands in hers. "Doctor," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how I can ever thank you. You didn't just save a man. You saved my whole world. Please, you must give me your contact information. We are forever in your debt, Doctor." Harris simply smiled. "I'm just glad I could be there. My information is on my card." He handed her a simple, elegant business card that read, "Dr. David Harris, MD, PhD, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery, the Johns Hopkins Hospital." Eleanor Bainbridge looked at the card, her eyes widening slightly as the full weight of his prestige registered. This wasn't just any doctor. This was one of the best in the world. The fact that he had been on this specific flight at this specific moment felt like nothing short of a miracle. As the paramedics wheeled her husband off the plane, George Findlay, the CEO of MedInnovate, clapped Dr. Harris on the shoulder. "David," he said, having dropped all formality, "that was the most remarkable thing I've ever witnessed. Forget the conference. You must have dinner with me and my wife tomorrow night. I'm not taking no for an answer. I have a proposal for you that I think you'll find very, very interesting. We're opening a new research institute in London, and it needs a director. A man of your caliber." He let the offer hang in the air, a life-changing opportunity, born from the ashes of a mid-air crisis. Dr. Harris, who had simply been on his way to give a speech, was now being courted for one of the most prestigious positions in European medicine. Ben Carter, the journalist, watched the exchange, his mind racing. He had it all: the hero's welcome, the grateful family, the massive career opportunity. It was the perfect ending to the hero's arc. Now he just needed the villains. He disembarked quickly, eager to write. The economy passengers were held back until Arthur Bainbridge and the first-class cabin had cleared. This meant Susan Covington was one of the last people to get off the plane. The walk through the jet bridge felt like a march to the gallows. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling. There were a dozen missed calls and frantic texts from her husband, Richard. "Where are you?" "I'm at the gate. The TechVantage deal is on a knife's edge. Need everything to be perfect. Call me the second you land." She stepped out into the arrivals hall and saw him immediately. Richard Covington was pacing, his handsome face etched with anxiety. He was a man who projected an image of effortless power, but today that image was cracking. When he saw her, he rushed over his face a mixture of relief and frustration. "Susan, there you are. What the hell happened?" "My flight tracker app said you were delayed. I've been going out of my mind." Before Susan could even begin to formulate a response, to spin a story that might salvage the situation, his phone rang. He looked at the caller ID, and his face went pale. "It's Bainbridge's assistant," he whispered, his eyes wide with panic. "God, what if he's calling to cancel the final meeting?" He answered the phone, forcing a smooth, confident tone into his voice. "Jonathan, hello, Richard Covington here. I was just about to call to—" He paused, listening. His confident expression slowly dissolved, replaced by one of utter confusion. "What?" "A medical emergency." "On the flight? Is he okay?" He listened for another 30 seconds, his face turning from pale to ashen. A doctor, a passenger, saved his life. Thank God. Of course, the meeting is the last thing on anyone's mind. Please send my absolute best to Arthur and his wife. He hung up the phone looking dazed. My God, he breathed. Arthur Bainbridge had a heart attack on the plane. Nearly died. Some doctor who happened to be a passenger saved his life. Can you believe the luck? Susan's heart hammered against her ribs. This was her chance. Her one slim chance to control the narrative. "Richard," she began, her voice weak, but it was too late. Ben Carter's story, complete with photos and video clips, had just gone live. He had published it on a popular news platform, and the headline was "Explosive Hero Doctor Saves CEO's Life. Mid-flight after being racially harassed by prominent Atlanta socialite." A phone pinged nearby. Then another. And another. All around them, people in the arrivals hall were looking down at their screens. A young woman standing near the Covingtons gasped and looked up, her eyes locking first on Susan, then on the picture in the news article, her expression one of dawning recognition. Richard's phone buzzed violently in his hand. It was a news alert. He glanced down, and the blood drained completely from his face. He read the headline, then looked at the photo accompanying the article. It was a picture of Susan. Her face contorted in a mask of ugly rage as she stood over a calm, dignified Dr. David Harris in the first-class cabin. It had been taken by another passenger and sent to Ben. He looked from the photo on his phone to his wife's face. He looked at her expensive shawl, her Chanel bag, her carefully constructed mask of privilege, and for the first time he saw her for what she was: a liability, a disaster. "Susan!" He whispered, his voice trembling with a rage that was far colder and more terrifying than hers had ever been. "What did you do?" The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The story went viral within hours. At Airline. Karen and Aunt Dr. Harris the hero were trending worldwide. The Covington name was attached to a story of ugly public racism. Richard's phone began to ring incessantly, not with business offers, but with calls from his board of directors, his investors, his lawyers. The Bainbridge family, upon learning the full story, were horrified. The idea that their patriarch's savior had been abused by the wife of a potential business partner was repulsive. The billion-dollar merger was not just cancelled, it was repudiated. TechVantage issued a public statement praising Dr. Harris and condemning the abhorrent behavior of Mrs. Covington, making it clear they would never do business with anyone associated with her. Susan Covington became a social pariah overnight. Her country club membership was revoked. She was disinvited from charity boards. Her friends, the same people who had mirrored her lifestyle, now shunned her, terrified of being tainted by her scandal. She had built her identity on a foundation of social status, and it had been obliterated. Her life as she knew it was over. She had demanded to be moved from a black man, convinced of her own superiority. And the universe had answered, not by moving her, but by moving the entire world around her, leaving her utterly and completely alone in the ruin she had created. Her demand for a new seat had cost her everything, a karmic bill delivered with ruthless pinpoint accuracy. And there you have it, the shocking real-life drama of Susan Covington. It's a powerful reminder that the choices we make, especially those fueled by hatred and prejudice, have consequences that can ripple out in the most unexpected and devastating ways. She thought she was above it all, but she learned that karma isn't just a concept, it's a force of nature, and it has a way of balancing the books, often when the whole world is watching. Dr. David Harris didn't ask for a fight, but his quiet dignity and incredible skill turned him into an unintentional agent of justice. What did you think of this story of instant karma? Let us know in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed something like this? If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with your friends, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true stories of drama and justice. Thank you for watching.